So the third part of clothing you want to think about after your actual protective clothing you wear or some spare clothing and how you're going to sleep is your shelter. What are you going to sleep in or under to protect yourself from another layer of the elements? So you can think of clothing as like everything else in 3 layers. The actual stuff on me, my layers I wear, my clothing, and then how I'm going to sleep and protect myself when I'm laying down, and then how I'm going to protect my sleeping area. Simplest thing for your shelter is a tarp. So this is a 10 by 10. I think this is one of our cheaper free soldiers. It's a 10 by 10 tarp. It's got the tie outs. It's the ones we use for UV as kind of our standard to teach people tarp craft. It's a good idea to pair your tarp with a bug net depending on the season. If you're bothered by bugs, I typically don't mind the bugs too much. Some people have gone almost insane. That was bad though with the mosquitoes, and Logan would have sold his feet for a bug net that time. And that guy from Ohio who wanted to go home because the bugs were so bad. So a tarp, probably throw a bug net in a couple months out of the year with Michigan. But you want to have some kind of tarp. It can be a big 10 by 10 with elaborate tie outs like this one, which is a little chunky. You could go with a Dyneema tarp. This is my 8 by 8 Dyneema tarp, and this weighs practically nothing. Also has the tie outs and things. It's basically extremely puncture resistant. It's completely waterproof, and it weighs almost nothing. Problem with Dyneema is it's really spendy. For the cost of this Dyneema tarp, I could buy 8 or 9 of these free soldiers. So, I mean, for an extra 2 pounds, this is kind of where you'd start to use this. And these are bigger and they're pretty forgiving in their configurations. But the Dyneema tarp saves me space and weight. And even if I don't think I'm going to need a tarp, it doesn't cost much as far as weight or energy-wise, to throw this in my bag. You can go all the way down to just one of these, we always call them space blankets, but just one of these reflective, heavy-duty, sometimes called a gum blanket. This one's maybe 5 by 6 or 5 by 7, but it's got some rings, grommets in the corners, and you can modify these or bulk them up a little bit before you go. You can throw that in this little bag. Just throw that in the bottom of my pack. It doesn't weigh much. This would be a good tarp to carry around in a day pack level. Just throw it in the bottom. Put a couple stakes and some cordage in there, and then you're ready to go. You've also got a ground pad. You can use this as a ground cloth under your sleeping pad, which is typically what I bring it for. You could go down a little further and just bring a couple 55-gallon drum liners of 3, 5, or 7 mil plastic. And we've made plenty of shelters out of these and open them up. This is another good, sometimes I just keep one in this little blue bag with my space blanket, a few stakes. This one is by Arcturus, by the way. So these are a little heavier duty than one you get from Coughlin's or, what's that Walmart brand of stuff? Ozark Trails, that kind of thing. So it's a pretty heavy duty one. Still only like 20 bucks. Arcturus. And you can put a drum liner in there for a ground pad. You make a little shelter out of this, ready to go. Besides the Dyneema or like a Free Soldier or Hennessy hammocks, Kamak hammocks, they have good tarps. What's the other one I'm thinking of? DD tarps. They have a 10 by 10. They're probably the best. This one is pretty cool. I picked this one up recently. This is Womack off of Coal Cracker Bushcraft. If you ever look him up, he's pretty knowledgeable guy. He's got a real big YouTube channel, the outdoor, more bushcrafty type stuff, Coal Cracker Bushcraft, as opposed to just camping and hiking safely. But he calls this the T60. That's an emergency shelter system. This is made of kind of a parachute type nylons, 100% waterproof, comes with cord already attached to the corners. It's 5 by 6, but look how small it smashes up. I mean, that can go right in literally in my pocket. And because the cords are already tied on the corners, you find 2 trees, you tie the cordage, it tucks into its own pocket, zip it up, 2 stakes along with this, and you got something to get out of the rain real quick. This is not my shelter for camping. Like, I'm not going to set this up to camp under or for winter. I'd use the Dyneema or the 10 by 10 or a heavier tarp for actual camping. But as an emergency tarp, it's a lot smaller than the Arcturus, and in a pinch it would work great, especially if you paired that up with a drum liner in your day bag. Another thing to talk about are ponchos. So this is just a USGI poncho. You can throw this in as your shelter component. You could make this your regular shelter, but I think of these more as like my day pack level or bedroll level shelters. But it comes in a little pouch. Again, I might throw 3 or 4 stakes in there, but it's just a USGI poncho. So this would serve as your outerwear or your rain protection, like at your clothing level, although I put rain gear under shelter. You got to have some kind of rain gear. Sometimes for me it's as simple as just I take a small folding umbrella. If you can get a lightweight travel umbrella, that's good too. If you just, maybe you're tucked under your shelter and it's raining at night and you got to use the latrine, you can just use the umbrella to walk out there instead of getting wet or having to take part of your shelter with you. This tarp, I don't know if we have a video or we're going to do videos on making a quick shelter out of these tarps. Yeah. But one of the good things about this tarp, or this poncho, is it can serve as an emergency shelter, my full shelter, rain gear. I can pair this with that blanket or a whoopee and make sort of an improvised outer layer in the winter, or if it turns cold overnight. We've been up north before. We went to the Bill's cabin that one time in April, and we got 10 inches of snow overnight. And we had gone up on Friday in the sunshine with shorts and tennis shoes, and they got the snow overnight. So you get stuck in a situation like that. Might be nice to have your poncho to pair up with a blanket or a poncho liner to make a sleeping bag. You can get your military whoopee, which is the same size as these US GI ponchos, and it has strings. You tie it in the corner, and then if you laid that over yourself, you'd have an extra layer of heat retention. Now, if you use a poncho or a garbage bag for heat retention, you're going to get wet because it retains heat because nothing gets through, like the moisture. But in a survival situation, that might be the way to go. So this is a good, maybe not a main shelter, like a tent or a good tarp, like that 10 by 10, but they make good day pack or second line level shelters. One more that I want to mention, Wilderness Innovation. Had this gear for a few years, and I really like it. This is their PSS, Poncho Survival Shelter System. That'd be P3Ss. I don't know. Wilderness Innovations. So this is a poncho. It's quite a bit bulkier, a little heavier than the regular poncho or those cheap one-use yellow ponchos. But this really heavy-duty poncho, and I've used this a lot of times. I've gone up several times with this as my main shelter. So I'll rig this up in an A-frame or a lean-to configuration. Can't make a cave since it's rectangular, but I use this as my shelter at night. Usually I'll take it if we're going to be out for a few days. I use this as my emergency shelter, my day shelter, secondary blanket, outerwear, and as rain gear. One of the cool things about the Wilderness Innovations, the PSS, is these snaps that match that quilt I showed in the other video with the hood. I can put that on. I think I wore that last time we were at the winter camp, the one you were just talking about, Dan. That was my winter coat, so I figured if I got cold, I could always put out my poncho and my sleeping blanket during the day. One of the niftiest things, Logan and I tested this a few years ago. We laid it out and piled probably half a quart of firewood and junk on it and dragged it back to camp because this stuff is amazing. It's not plastic, it's just a heavy woven, almost 1000D Cordura. I mean, it's super, super strong. It's also got these 2 channels in the end, and you run a couple pieces of paracord or some Dyneema cord through that and bunch the ends up and make this into a hammock. And I've spent many a night sleeping in this as a hammock. So we'll probably have a video with we'll do a whole Wilderness Innovations gear review. You can pair this with the sleeping pad they have called the Beast, which is like 3 inches of foam. It's gigantic. I would never carry it on a hike. But for car camping, it's awesome. It's so luxurious. But you can snap your poncho along with the buttons of your quilt and then snap that to the pad. And then the pad goes on this little ground tarp kit they have. So you lay this down, then the sleeping pad, then the blanket, and then with a couple of poles that run through, you fling the poncho over it, and it's got all the things put together in one component. Pretty neat, unless you have to pee in the middle of the night, because your poncho is now your tent. But you can use that as a Hammock as well. I've done that before, and then I use that quilt liner. I just use that as my underquilt, just leave it snapped to the outside of the hammock. So Wilderness Innovations, Perry Peacock is the guy that owns that. Nice guy, neat channel. He's got a whole series of little spendy on some of it, but the gear is really top notch. I've had this poncho, and I've used it for shelter, poncho, hammock. I've used it for years with some of his other gear, so that's really good. But for a shelter level of your clothing, you have to have some way to protect yourself from the elements. It's got to be waterproof. It's got to be big enough to be used in multiple configurations, like a 10 by 10 or an 8 by 8 tarp. And then that would be your main tent, maybe paired with a bug net and a ground cloth, or your main shelter. Your day pack or bedroll level shelter, you're going to want something like a USGI poncho, one of these cold cracker bushcraft ponchos, maybe just a space blanket, or if you're really trimming the fat, just a couple drum liners. You can make a shelter in a pinch, right? Depends on what you're going for, like safety or shelter. Yeah, we're going to get to the other part of the shelter is the pitch kit, which is over here. So your shelter is going to need a pitch kit. So that could be something as simple as just having, we'll talk about cordage in another video, just a ridge line. But make sure if you're going with a hammock for your shelter, you want to take your hammock straps. You got to have a way to attach the hammock to the tree. That's it's happened to me before. Get up there, can't tell you how heartbreaking it is to have your hammock laid out under your shelter in the rain and have no straps to hang it to the tree. So don't forget the straps. And then, depending how you organize stuff, I found these neat little Milwaukee tool bags the other day for a couple dollars at a gear sale. And in here, I just have a little bag I organize. I keep a preloaded ridge line with some prusik loops tied to that for shelter building. I've thrown just some cheap aluminum stakes. I've got a dozen or so stakes here because they're light and I can use those to configure my shelters. Got some poles in case I'm going to put out my hammock's bug net, or if I need to lay my poncho over in a shelter configuration. And then I've got a few pre-cut 6 to 10 foot hanks of paracord. I've got 4 of them just so that I can help kind of tie out and presuppose my or pre-plan out my shelter. A ridge line, stakes, and a few pre-cut hunks of cord don't necessarily count towards your cordage kit. I just keep these dedicated to my shelter, knowing I have them, and that's why most of my uses for cordage is shelter. My cordage, when we get to that, usually just consists of extra cordage or multi-use cordage and my rope. So I keep these in a little bag, and they go in with my, next to my tarp, for instance. My tarp or my ground cloth and a bag. So this would be a good shelter kit for me when I go out packing, depending on what I'm doing. If I wanted to get really fancy, my shelter would consist of a full 10 by 10 tarp with my pitch kit or my shelter kit. So I would throw those. Maybe I'd even pair that up with a luxurious ground cloth so I'm not on the wet if I'm going to sleep on the ground. Or if maybe I want something to step down onto while I put my boots on in the morning if I'm hammock camping. So those are the components of the shelter. So when you're going down your list, am I taking a tarp or a tent? I have my stakes and my ridge line. Do I have any accessory poles that I need for my hammock or my tarp? Do I have a ground tarp or a space blanket? Some kind of drum liner or garbage bag? We always include this as our pocket and pouch level because it can be something goes in the back pocket. You use this as an emergency poncho. You can use it as shelter like we said. But one of the things the UV tries to do when we go out with our garbage bags is pick up trash. So when we see trash, we always try to bring at least one garbage bag full of trash out each time we go out on a trip. They're just kind of chipping away at the problem. So you always have a garbage bag with you. A couple other things you could have would be, as far as shelter goes, would be a stool of some sort. Now this is my stool. It's just the stool liner. Sometimes I find some sticks. I lash them in a little tripod and I form myself a little 3-legged stool. You can leave the legs on this and just fold the stool up depending on where you're going to be going. Maybe you don't want to sit on the damp ground. Maybe you've got a sprained ankle, you're recovering from some sort of injury where getting down on the ground might not be what you do that time. So you take a stool with you, or what we call a ground buddy would just be this. I sit down on it so I just don't get my butt wet. And Emily came up with the best idea for ground buddies a few years ago, turned us on to that. An Amazon bag. You know, they send it in those little crinkly white and blue bags. They're totally waterproof. They weigh nothing. They're free. I mean, they come with your gift. Yeah, they're somewhat reflective, protect your heat, right? Your butt from losing heat. Just fold that Amazon bag up in there. Then you got a quick ground buddy. Take that with you. Another optional piece of gear is a trekking pole. We don't want to go full bushcraft. I mean, bushcrafting's fine. I'm not picking on that. It's a skill. But you don't want to go full bushcraft and think, well, I'll just cut my poles for shelter, or cut my poles for a stool, or cut my poles for a tripod. If everybody's out cutting poles all the time, you're damaging the environment a little too much. Plus, you're really not supposed to do that in shared space, like state forest and national forest. So if I'm planning on going to an area where there's maybe not so many trees, like a desert hike, where there's not too many trees to tie my shelter or my hammock up to, I'll just throw a trekking pole in, or sometimes people use a pair of trekking poles for what they're actually intended. But I'll throw a trekking pole into my gear, so now I've got kind of a modified pole, center pole for my tarp shelter configurations. You can use these, like I have, to lean out of my hammock and hook something off the ground because I'm too lazy to get out. I really want that water bottle, so I'll hook that out there. You use them as a fishing pole. A lot of uses for a trekking pole, actually. So sometimes you'll see that I have a trekking pole with me. It's part of my shelter. I don't use it for trekking. I have it along for other things. Maybe that one time we thought that was a bear den. It turned out to not be a bear. It was a porcupine. But instead of going down the hole and touching it, we could have poked it with a stick. That would have been a good idea. So those are some of the things under the shelter component. So this video is the end of the clothing. We talked about personal clothing protection layer, your sleeping, which is most important, and then that third layer would be your shelter, tarps and tents, ground cloths, and ways to sleep or shelter from the sun or the rain or the cold or the wind in order to conserve or regulate your core temperature. So that's it for clothing. The next video is the cut and dig tools.